If she takes one more impact to the ribs, she may never recover. The words were spoken in a low voice, meant for a doctor's ears only. But Admiral Richard Hayes heard every single one of them. He stopped in the hallway outside the medical evaluation room and slowly turned toward the partially open door. Inside, Captain Emma Walker sat quietly on the edge of an examination table. Her posture was straight. Her expression was calm. And somehow, she looked completely unaffected by the conversation happening around her. The physician lowered a folder and glanced toward Emma. "I'm serious," he continued. "The old injuries are still there. She shouldn't even be carrying the load she carries every day." Emma offered no response. She simply nodded once and reached for her uniform jacket. Admiral Hayes frowned. He had reviewed thousands of military records during his 30 years in uniform. He knew the names of decorated officers. He knew who had earned commendations. He knew who had seen combat and who had spent their careers behind desks. Yet somehow, Captain Emma Walker remained an enigma. She was respected but rarely discussed, highly rated but strangely overlooked. Every report described her the same way: reliable, disciplined, professional, nothing more, nothing less. As Emma stepped out of the room, she nearly walked past the Admiral before noticing him. "Sir." She stopped and offered a crisp salute. Hayes returned it automatically. "Captain Walker." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Everything all right?" "Yes, sir." Doctor sounded concerned. "Doctors usually are, sir." There was no humor in her voice. No complaint either. Just a simple statement of fact. Before Hayes could ask another question, Emma excused herself and continued down the corridor. The Admiral watched her disappear around the corner. Something about the encounter bothered him. Most officers volunteered explanations. Most people wanted sympathy when medical issues affected their careers. Emma never did. She simply carried on. 3 days later, Naval Station Norfolk prepared for one of the most prestigious assignments of the year. A multinational security operation in the North Atlantic would require some of the Navy's most experienced personnel. Selection boards met all morning. Officers crowded briefing rooms. Names were discussed. Records were reviewed. Careers could change in a single afternoon. Emma Walker's name appeared on the preliminary list. Then it disappeared. Nobody seemed surprised. In fact, a few younger officers exchanged knowing smiles. "Guess the legend finally ran out of luck," one lieutenant muttered. "What legend?" another asked. "Exactly." A few quiet laughs followed. The comments spread through the building faster than official announcements. By lunchtime, rumors had already formed. Some claimed Emma's health was failing. Others insisted she was avoiding deployment. A few suggested she simply wasn't capable anymore. Through it all, Emma remained exactly the same. She ate lunch alone near a window overlooking the harbor. Cargo vessels drifted across the gray water. Helicopters crossed the horizon. Sailors moved between buildings. And Emma sat silently, staring toward the Atlantic Ocean as if none of the whispers existed. Across the dining facility, Lieutenant Brandon Keller noticed her sitting by herself. Young, ambitious, and eager to impress others. He smirked as he walked past a table of fellow officers. "Funny how some people spend years building a reputation," he said loudly, making sure his voice carried. "Then the moment a real mission comes up, they suddenly find reasons to stay behind." Several heads turned toward Emma. She didn't react. She didn't even look up. She simply continued eating her lunch while the room slowly fell silent around her. And for reasons he could not yet explain, Admiral Richard Hayes found himself watching her more closely than ever before. The selection board meeting ended just after 2 o'clock that afternoon. Officers filed out of the conference room carrying folders, coffee cups, and opinions. Most of them had already moved on to other topics, but Admiral Richard Hayes remained seated at the long polished table. A single personnel file rested in front of him. Captain Emma Walker. He opened it again. The contents were strangely ordinary. Excellent evaluations. Outstanding leadership scores. Consistent. Recommendations for advancement. Yet entire sections were restricted. Dates were missing. Assignments were partially redacted. Even after all his years of service, Hayes rarely encountered records that looked like this. The door opened behind him. Commander Lisa Grant stepped inside, carrying a stack of briefing documents. She noticed the file immediately. "Still looking at Walker?" she asked. Hayes leaned back in his chair. "Something does not add up." Grant nodded. "People have been saying that for years." "What exactly is her story?" Hayes asked. "Depends who you ask." Grant placed the folders on the table. Some people think she spent years attached to special operations support teams. Others say intelligence assignments. Nobody really knows. She never talks about herself. Hayes tapped the file with one finger. And now she is off the deployment list. Medical recommendation. Yet she keeps showing up for duty every day. Grant smiled faintly. That is Emma Walker. Across the base, Emma finished reviewing maintenance reports inside a quiet operations office. The room was nearly empty except for a young petty officer organizing supply requests. Outside the windows, dark clouds rolled across the harbor. The weather forecast predicted heavy rain by evening. Emma worked steadily without acknowledging the rumors spreading through the station. She had heard them all before. Some questioned her commitment. Others questioned her courage. None of them mattered. What mattered were the sailors under her supervision and the responsibilities waiting on her desk. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. Lieutenant Brandon Keller stepped into the office without waiting for permission. His confidence arrived several seconds before he did. Captain. Emma looked up calmly. Lieutenant. Keller crossed his arms. I heard about the deployment board. Emma returned her attention to the paperwork. Then you heard the same information everyone else did. Keller smirked. People expected more from someone with your reputation. The petty officer in the corner froze. Emma signed a document and set it aside. If you have official business, Lieutenant, I am listening. Just curious. His smile widened. A lot of us wonder what happened. You used to volunteer for every difficult assignment. Emma finally met his eyes. Her expression remained completely neutral. Curiosity can be useful. So can discretion. Keller shifted slightly. For a brief moment, he seemed unsure of himself. Then he laughed. You know, some people are starting to think the stories about you were exaggerated. The office became very quiet. Rain began tapping softly against the windows. Emma stood and walked toward a filing cabinet. Her movements were unhurried. Then those people are entitled to their opinions. Keller expected an argument. He expected anger. Instead, he found himself speaking to someone who appeared completely unaffected by his remarks. Somehow that unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the doorway. The Admiral wants to see you tomorrow morning. Emma paused. Did he say why? Keller shook his head. No, but whatever it is, it sounds important. After he left, Emma remained standing beside the cabinet. For the first time all day, a shadow crossed her expression. Outside, thunder rolled across the harbor, while somewhere in another building Admiral Richard Hayes prepared questions that only one person on the entire base could answer. The next morning arrived wrapped in thick gray fog drifting in from the Atlantic. Naval Station Norfolk moved at its usual pace, but for Captain Emma Walker, the day felt different. At exactly 8 o'clock, she stood outside the Admiral's office in full uniform, waiting patiently beside a polished wooden door. A young yeoman opened it and nodded. The Admiral will see you now, Captain. Emma stepped inside. Admiral Richard Hayes stood near a large window overlooking the harbor. Cargo ships moved slowly through the morning haze while tugboats guided them toward distant piers. The office itself was immaculate. Framed photographs lined the walls. Awards occupied display shelves. Everything reflected decades of service and leadership. Hayes turned toward her. At ease, Captain. Emma relaxed slightly, but remained standing. The Admiral studied her for several seconds. I reviewed your record again last night. Emma did not respond. You have one of the strongest service histories I have seen in years. Still, she remained silent. Hayes folded his hands behind his back. And yet there are gaps. Some assignments remain restricted, sir. Even to an admiral? Emma held his gaze. Those restrictions were not placed there by me. Hayes walked toward his desk and opened a folder. Let us talk about the deployment board. Yes, sir. You were removed based on medical recommendations. That is correct. Do you agree with that decision? The question lingered in the room. Emma considered it carefully. My agreement is not required, sir. Hayes narrowed his eyes. That was not my question. For the first time, a faint tension appeared in Emma's expression. No, sir. I do not agree with it. The Admiral nodded slowly. Then why accept it? Emma looked toward the harbor outside the window. Because sometimes there are factors larger than personal preference. Hayes sensed she was choosing every word with extreme care. Your physician seems concerned. Doctors are paid to be concerned. And your injuries? Emma's eyes returned to him immediately. The room became very quiet. They are being managed, sir. Managed, Hayes repeated. That sounds like an answer designed to avoid giving an answer. Emma said nothing. The Admiral walked around the desk and sat down. Captain, I am trying to understand something. You have turned down 2 advisory promotions. You rarely speak about your accomplishments. You avoid attention. And now you are stepping away from one of the most important operations of the year. He leaned forward slightly. Most officers spend their careers chasing opportunities like these. Emma remained perfectly still. I am aware of that, sir. Hayes opened another section of her file. Then explain it to me. Several seconds passed. The ticking of a wall clock seemed unusually loud. Finally, Emma spoke. Because if I explain it, sir, someone else's family pays the price. Hayes blinked. The answer was so unexpected that he almost questioned whether he had heard correctly. What does that mean? Emma lowered her eyes. Briefly, it means exactly what I said. The Admiral stared at her. The mystery surrounding Captain Emma Walker had only deepened. And for the first time, he began to suspect that whatever truth she was protecting had nothing to do with her career and everything to do with a sacrifice nobody on the base knew existed. Emma Walker left the Admiral's office with the same calm expression she had worn when she entered, but Richard Hayes remained seated long after the door closed behind her. Her answer echoed through the quiet room. Because if I explain it, someone else's family pays the price. He had spent decades interviewing officers, intelligence personnel, pilots, and special operators. He knew when people were hiding incompetence. He knew when they were protecting themselves. What he had seen in Emma was neither. Whatever burden she carried, she seemed determined to carry it alone. Later that afternoon, Hayes requested access to additional records. The response arrived less than an hour later. Access denied. The message was brief, official, and unusually firm. Even more surprising, the denial originated from an authority outside his chain of command. The Admiral stared at the screen. That had not happened in years. Meanwhile, Emma returned to her duties as though nothing had changed. She attended planning meetings, reviewed schedules, and checked readiness reports. Sailors greeted her in passing. She greeted them back. Nobody would have guessed that one of the most senior officers in the Navy had spent the morning trying unsuccessfully to uncover her past. By evening, a heavy storm rolled across the coastline. Rain hammered the windows of the operations building while thunder rolled over the harbor. Most personnel had already gone home. Emma remained at her desk. A stack of reports sat beside her untouched coffee mug. The office lights reflected against the dark glass outside. Then her secure phone rang. Emma froze for a fraction of a second before answering. Walker. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. We heard there were questions. Emma's expression tightened. Questions happen. Not from admirals. Silence followed. Finally, the voice spoke again. Do not tell him. I was not planning to. Good. The line disconnected. Emma slowly lowered the receiver. For several moments, she remained motionless. Then she looked toward the rain-covered window and exhaled quietly. Across the base, Admiral Hayes stood inside an archive room reviewing historical deployment records. He had followed a trail of scattered references that seemed disconnected at first. Dates, locations, personnel transfers, medical evacuations. Most led nowhere. Then one detail caught his attention. 10 years earlier, a multinational maritime operation in the Mediterranean had suffered a catastrophic emergency during a classified mission. Much of the report remained restricted, but one line remained visible. Multiple personnel survived due to the actions of an unidentified officer. Hayes frowned. He vaguely remembered the operation. He remembered confusion. He remembered months of unanswered questions afterward. What he did not remember was ever learning the name of the officer involved. A cold feeling settled in his chest. For reasons he could not explain, he suddenly thought of Emma Walker. Back in her office, Emma opened a drawer and removed a small worn photograph. The image showed several smiling service members standing on the deck of a ship beneath bright Mediterranean sunlight. One face had been carefully folded out of view years ago. Emma studied the picture for a long moment before returning it to the drawer. Outside, the storm intensified. Inside, two people on opposite sides of the base found themselves staring into the past, unaware that the truth connecting them was moving closer with every passing hour. The following morning began with clear skies, but the atmosphere across the base felt unusually heavy. Rumors continued spreading through hallways, briefing rooms, and break areas. Nobody knew exactly why Captain Emma Walker had been removed from the deployment roster, yet everyone seemed to have a theory. Some blamed her medical history. Others claimed she had lost the confidence that once made her stand out. A few simply enjoyed having a mystery to discuss. Emma ignored all of it. She arrived before sunrise, reviewed overnight reports, and completed every task on her schedule with the same steady discipline she had shown for years. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a message arrived requesting her presence in the main command building. The request came directly from Admiral Richard Hayes. When Emma entered the conference room, she immediately noticed several senior officers seated around the large table. Lieutenant Brandon Keller was there as well. The moment she stepped inside, conversation stopped. Hayes stood near the head of the table. His expression was more serious than usual. "Captain Walker, thank you for coming." "Yes, sir." The Admiral gestured toward an empty chair. "Please sit." Emma complied. A thick folder rested on the table in front of Hayes. He opened it slowly. "Over the past 24 hours, I have attempted to better understand your situation." Emma remained silent. "What I discovered raises more questions than answers." Several officers exchanged curious glances. Hayes continued. "Your record contains restrictions unlike anything I have encountered in years. Entire sections remain inaccessible. Requests for clarification have been denied." Keller looked surprised. The other officers appeared equally confused. Emma simply listened. "Captain," Hayes said carefully, "I need to know whether your current medical condition creates a risk to personnel under your command." The room became completely silent. Emma answered immediately. "No, sir." "Can you state that with certainty?" "Yes, sir." Hayes studied her face. "Then help me understand why so many people seem determined to keep information hidden." For the first time, Emma hesitated. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but everyone noticed it. "Because the information does not belong entirely to me." Several officers frowned. Keller leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated by the cryptic answer. "With respect, sir," he interrupted, looking toward Hayes, "how are we supposed to evaluate leadership readiness if nobody will explain anything?" The comment hung in the air. Emma turned toward him. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried a quiet weight that immediately made Keller uncomfortable. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the full truth involves people who never volunteered to become part of a story." Nobody responded. Hayes noticed something important in that moment. Emma was not protecting herself. She was protecting someone else. The realization shifted something in his thinking. He closed the folder and looked around the room. "This discussion is over." The officers seemed surprised. Hayes stood. "Captain Walker will continue her current duties." One by one, personnel began leaving the conference room. Within minutes, only Hayes and Emma remained. The Admiral waited until the door closed. Then he spoke quietly. "Who are you protecting?" Emma looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "Someone who deserves a normal life, sir." For the first time since this mystery began, Hayes saw genuine sadness behind her composure. And somehow, that answer troubled him more than all the classified records combined. After the meeting, Admiral Richard Hayes found it impossible to focus on anything else. Reports accumulated on his desk. Messages waited for responses. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the same question. Who was Emma Walker protecting? Late that evening, most of the base had settled into its normal routine. Office lights switched off one by one. Hallways grew quiet. But Hayes remained in his office, staring at a photograph taken nearly a decade earlier. The image showed a group of naval personnel standing aboard a vessel somewhere in the Mediterranean. Faces smiled at the camera. Uniforms were different. Haircuts were different. Careers were different. Time had changed almost everything. Almost. One face caught his attention. The image quality was poor, but there was something familiar about the young officer standing near the edge of the group. Before he could examine it further, a knock sounded at the door. Commander Lisa Grant entered carrying several folders. She immediately noticed the photograph. "You are still chasing this?" she asked. Hayes nodded. "I cannot explain it." Grant sat across from him. "Maybe because none of this feels like a career issue anymore." Hayes looked up. "What do you mean?" "I think whatever happened 10 years ago changed. Her life." Grant paused. "And maybe yours too." The words lingered in the room. Hayes said nothing. Deep down, he suspected she might be right. The next morning, Emma reported to duty as usual. She spent hours reviewing logistics schedules and personnel readiness reports. Nothing about her behavior suggested concern. Nothing suggested fear. Yet several people noticed she seemed more tired than usual. Even Lieutenant Brandon Keller noticed. Near lunchtime, he found her alone outside the administration building overlooking the harbor. For several seconds, he hesitated before approaching. "Captain." Emma turned. "Lieutenant." Keller shifted awkwardly. The confidence he normally carried was missing. "I wanted to say something." Emma waited. "I may have made assumptions." A faint breeze moved across the waterfront. "Most people do," Emma replied gently. Keller looked toward the water. "Still, I should not have." Emma studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once. "Thank you." The conversation ended there. No lecture. No resentment. No attempt to embarrass him. Somehow that simple response left a stronger impression than any argument could have. Later that afternoon, Emma received another message from Admiral Hayes requesting a private meeting. When she arrived, she immediately sensed something had changed. The Admiral stood beside his desk holding the old photograph. His expression was serious. "Captain," he said quietly, "I think we are past the point where general answers are enough." Emma's eyes moved briefly toward the photograph in his hand. For the first time in weeks, genuine concern crossed her face. Hayes noticed it instantly. "I am not asking because I am curious anymore," he continued. "I am asking because whatever happened has affected every decision you have made since." Silence filled the office. Emma looked away. Outside the window, the harbor reflected the late afternoon sun. Ships moved slowly across the water. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet inside the room, tension continued building. Hayes placed the photograph on the desk between them. "Please," he said, "help me understand." Emma stared at the image for a long moment. Then she slowly closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the quiet distance she normally maintained seemed heavier than ever. And for the first time since this began, she appeared uncertain whether the truth could remain hidden much longer. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The photograph remained on the desk between them like a bridge connecting two moments separated by 10 years. Admiral Richard Hayes watched Emma carefully. He had seen her remain calm under scrutiny, remain composed under criticism, and remain silent when others demanded explanations. Now, for the first time, he saw the weight she carried. Emma slowly sat down across from him. Her eyes never left the photograph. "You should stop looking into this, sir," she said quietly. Hayes shook his head. "I cannot." Emma gave a faint smile, though there was no humor behind it. "That is exactly what I was afraid of." The Admiral leaned forward. "Then tell me why." She remained silent. Outside the office window, sunlight reflected across the harbor. A helicopter passed in the distance. The world continued moving while the truth waited between them. Finally, Hayes spoke again. "The operation in the Mediterranean." Emma's expression changed instantly. "You found that report." "Part of it." He paused. "Not enough to understand what happened." Emma looked away. "That was intentional." Hayes opened a thin folder beside him. "The official record states that an unidentified officer's actions prevented the loss of multiple personnel." Emma closed her eyes briefly. "That is all the record should say." "Why?" Hayes asked. "Because names create consequences." The Admiral studied her carefully. "You keep saying that." Emma looked back at him. "Because it is true." Silence returned. Then Hayes asked the question that had haunted him for days. "Was it you?" The room seemed to grow smaller. Emma did not answer immediately. Her gaze drifted toward the harbor once more. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "Some people survived. Because of you?" Emma's jaw tightened. "That is not important." Hayes immediately knew he had his answer. He sat back slowly. Years of uncertainty suddenly felt closer than ever to resolution. "Captain," he said, "why spend 10 years hiding something like that?" Emma stared at the photograph. "Because the story does not belong to me alone." The Admiral frowned. "I still do not understand." Emma reached toward the image. Her finger stopped over the section where one face had been folded out of view years earlier. Hayes noticed it immediately. "Who was there?" he asked. Emma lowered her hand. "Someone who was given a second chance at life." The answer only deepened the mystery. Yet something else now occupied the Admiral's attention. As Emma shifted slightly in her chair, she winced. It was brief. So brief most people would have missed it. Hayes did not. "You are in pain." "No, sir." That was not convincing. Emma managed a faint smile. "I am fine." The Admiral looked at her for several moments. Then his eyes moved toward the medical folder sitting beside the photograph. Suddenly, a dozen disconnected details began forming a single picture. Restricted records, medical exemptions, denied access requests, the physician's warning, the missing years, the old operation. Everything seemed connected. And for the first time, Hayes realized the truth he was searching for might be far more personal than any classified mission report could ever reveal. Admiral Richard Hayes slowly stood from his chair. The office felt unusually quiet. Even the distant sounds of activity from the harbor seemed to fade into the background. His attention remained fixed on Emma Walker. For days he had searched for answers inside reports, personnel files, and restricted records. Yet every path had led back to the same person sitting across from him. "Captain," he said carefully, "I think we are done talking around the truth." Emma remained silent. Hayes walked around the desk and stopped near the window. "You have spent years protecting a secret. You have accepted criticism. You have allowed people to question your judgment. You have allowed people to believe things that are not true." He turned toward her. "Why?" Emma looked down at her hands. "Because it was easier." "For who?" Hayes asked. "For everyone." The answer frustrated him more than he expected. "No," he said, firmly. "Not everyone. Maybe easier for them. Not for you." Emma said nothing. Several long seconds passed. Then the Admiral picked up the medical folder. "The physician believes your condition is serious." Emma's expression hardened slightly. "My condition is manageable." That is not what he said. Doctors always assume the worst. Hayes placed the folder back on the desk. "Then show me I am wrong." The room fell silent. Emma looked toward the door as though considering whether to leave. Instead, she slowly exhaled. Years of discipline kept her expression calm, but exhaustion had finally begun to show. "You are not going to stop asking, are you?" Hayes shook his head. "No." Emma gave a faint nod, almost as if she had expected that answer all along. Then she rose from her chair. The Admiral watched in confusion as she stepped closer to the window where sunlight filled the room. Her movements were slow and deliberate. There was no anger in them, no drama, only quiet resignation. 10 years, she said softly. 10 years of trying to make sure nobody had to carry this except me." Hayes frowned. "Carry what?" Emma looked out across the harbor one final time. Then she carefully lifted the side of her uniform shirt just enough to reveal part of her ribcage. The Admiral froze. A network of old surgical scars crossed her side. Some were thin and faded. Others were more pronounced. They told a story no official report ever could. Hayes stared in disbelief. He had seen service-related injuries before. He had seen the cost of sacrifice. But what struck him was not the scars themselves. It was the realization that Emma had been carrying them quietly while continuing to serve without complaint. His eyes widened as he noticed something else. The pattern matched information buried inside a medical briefing he had reviewed years earlier after the Mediterranean operation. Suddenly, fragmented memories rushed back. A damaged vessel, confusion, emergency reports, an unidentified officer, and a name that had never appeared. Emma lowered her shirt and faced him. Neither of them spoke. For the first time since this mystery began, Admiral Richard Hayes finally understood that the answers he had been chasing were standing directly in front of him all along. For a long moment, Admiral Richard Hayes could not speak. The office remained completely silent except for the distant hum of activity from the harbor below. Emma Walker stood across from him with the same calm composure she had carried through every conversation, every rumor, and every accusation. Yet now the silence between them carried a different meaning. Hayes slowly lowered his eyes to the photograph resting on the desk. The missing pieces were finally beginning to fit together. The unidentified officer, the restricted records, the denied access requests, the medical exemptions, the years of quiet service without recognition. He looked back at Emma. "It was you." Emma did not answer. She did not need to. The truth was already written across the years she had spent protecting it. Hayes felt a wave of memories return. 10 years earlier, he had been a senior officer assigned to a multinational operation in the Mediterranean. The mission had ended in confusion. Reports had been incomplete. Details had disappeared behind layers of classification. What he remembered most clearly was waking up afterward and being told that several lives had been saved because someone had acted without hesitation. He had spent years assuming he would never learn who that person was. Now he knew. Emma slowly took a seat again. "I never wanted anyone to know," she said quietly. Hayes stared at her. "Why?" Emma folded her hands. because the attention would have followed other people. Families, teammates, people who deserved peace. The Admiral shook his head in disbelief. You gave up promotions. They were not important. You accepted criticism. That was easier. You let people question your commitment. Emma offered a faint smile. People are allowed to be wrong. The simplicity of the answer struck him harder than any speech could have. For years, she had carried a burden that would have earned admiration from almost everyone around her. Instead of using it, she had hidden it. Instead of demanding recognition, she had continued working. Instead of asking for respect, she had earned it quietly every single day. Hayes stood slowly. Emma looked up in confusion. The Admiral moved around the desk until he stood directly in front of her. Then, without saying a word, he came to attention. Emma immediately rose from her chair. Before she could react, Admiral Richard Hayes rendered a formal salute. The gesture froze her in place. "Sir," she began. Hayes interrupted gently. "No, Captain." His voice carried an emotion few people had ever heard from him. "For 10 years I have been thanking the wrong people." Emma's eyes widened. The room fell silent once more. Neither rank nor position seemed important anymore. Only truth remained. After a moment, Emma returned the salute. Outside the office window, sunlight reflected across the harbor. Ships continued their journeys. Sailors continued their duties. Life moved forward as it always had. But inside that room, something had changed forever. Word never spread beyond a small circle. No ceremony followed. No public announcement appeared. Emma Walker returned to her responsibilities the next morning exactly as she always had. Yet the people who truly understood her story never looked at her the same way again, because they had finally learned a lesson that could not be found in any manual or training course. Real strength rarely introduces itself. Real sacrifice rarely asks to be noticed. And the people most worthy of respect are often the ones who never ask for it at all.